This is the Subspace Exploration Project.
Join us for a deep dive into kink, non-monogamy, mental and emotional health,
gender expression, and community building.
In each episode, we're deconstructing the gender binary, celebrating queer culture, and creating a safe space for sex education, all while learning from authors, educators, mental health professionals, and folks like you and me.
In this episode of the Subspace Exploration Project, Clay and Todd journey to Seattle to meet with Sar Surmick from the Consent Academy to discuss nuance and the evolution of consent culture and the language we use to discuss it. They talk about our capacity to take on the responsibilities of intimacy anytime we engage with others and the importance of trust to heal and repair when mistakes are inevitably made. Let's check it out.
Here we are.
Hello, Sar.
Hi, Sar.
Hello. I learned of you through the Lee Harrington Passion and Soul podcast.
Oh, yeah.
You had a brilliant conversation with Lee Harrington, and that was a number of years ago, and there's been millions of conversations about consent since then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the conversation around consent has really evolved in the last, what has it been, 6 years?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, language is ever evolving, and if language is changing all the time, then the language we use to describe things and
very much.
that changes just as much.
I was hoping you could quickly introduce yourself and what the Consent Academy is.
Sure. So my name is Sar Surmick. I'm a marriage and family therapist here in Seattle, Washington. I also work as a professor at Antioch University, Seattle. I'm the director emeritus of the Consent Academy. We formed the Consent Academy back in 2016 as an educational collective. Our mandate was to try to teach consent across the broadest possible format. And so when we put the Consent Academy together, our goal was to find a way to talk about not the how to do consent, because there are a lot of people who talk about that and talk about it well.
Mm-hmm.
But our goal was to talk about what is consent, to talk about sort of the underlying foundational frameworks, and then how to apply those either to an individual, but more often on the organizational level. And so while our initial work very much started in doing just sort of one-off workshops, consent basics, trying to get people to understand that consent is more than no means no or yes means yes, which was the big conversation that was happening back when we started. Mm-hmm. From there, we really took it up a notch to sort of train other people how to talk about consent and to help organizations put together consent policy and procedure and how to use consent in a way that is both beneficial to the organization, but also beneficial to their constituents.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. We were just visiting with a group in Ashland, Oregon, Naughty Productions, and they do a lot of rope suspension and rope education, as well as classes on consent, boundaries, negotiation,
General sex education, kink education, beyond shibari.
Mm-hmm.
And we sat down. We've got this upcoming project. It's kind of slow going because it's all crowdfunded, but we've got this BDSM 101 project, and they put together a little module on consent, and they brought up some great ideas, but it's kind of like it's a jumping off point.
Yeah.
Just like no means no and yes means yes was kind of like a no-brainer jumping off point back in the 90s, you know, or whenever that came around.
For some people, I assume.
For some people.
Not for everybody.
Especially given I've talked to everyone from like colleges to kink organizations to grade schools to high schools to to organizations, tech companies, like the whole nine yards. And it does often amaze me how much we sometimes have to go back to the basics to really get into like, oh yeah, if someone says no, you should stop.
Yeah.
And like in the BDSM world, like that, the conversation has moved way beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
But I find often in the more mundane world,
Yeah.
that is still often the place we have to start with a conversation.
Mm-hmm. I think in the BDSM world, because people are so like, they're really trying to push boundaries, and like it can be dangerous and harmful if not done with such in-depth conversation about consent and boundaries.
Yeah.
And it's about navigating that gray area and making sure that like, because there are times where consent can seem kind of fuzzy, and you got to have a system in place that allows you to be able to negotiate that and navigate it when it's feeling fuzzy.
Yeah.
We talked a lot about different consent models with KP, and something I noticed is that like, maybe this was half because I was tired and half because like they're rearranging things as they're like figuring out how to present this, as you do when you're catching it on camera, is that like so many things overlap, and there seems to be, maybe the word is like pedantic almost, like just trying to get into this is different from this, which leads into this, and
it could be very nuanced.
Yes, nuanced.
Oh yeah.
Which, when you're trying to teach a room full of people, it's hard to get into the nuanced approach, like a nuanced understanding, an individual understanding.
Especially if that room full of people is not actually there.
Yeah.
Like if in our case, we were just filming between us. And so sometimes you rely on group discussion to be like, wait, can you explain what that means or give me an example? So you're trying to think of all those things ahead of time.
Yeah, it's tough.
Yeah.
It's tough. Yeah, I love teaching in person. So you like get that feel for like, you say something and half the people in the room are like, what?
Yeah.
I don't understand. And then you can go over it in a way that's easier.
You can meet them where they're at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's hard because like a lot of consent is actually gray. Like people seem to want this very definitive binary, like it is either consensual or it is not consensual. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is that, we look at consent as a spectrum base.
Yeah.
Like it is nearly impossible to get to 100%. And so most people, even when they're doing consent really well, are operating in the 80 to 90% range.
Yeah.
Which means the risk of a consent incident or a consent violation happening is pretty small.
Yeah.
But it's still present.
Yes.
Versus the people who operate in the 10% range, in which case, like your risk is just way higher.
Yes.
And then we can get into the nuance of talking about the people who are intentionally not practicing in a consensual way. And they're just not even on the spectrum to begin with because they're intentionally or unintentionally, like they don't have the knowledge necessary to practice consent in a way that supports the agency and autonomy of the person they're working with.
I'm really curious about like when you work with companies and businesses, like what are y'all talking about in terms of consent for organizations?
We often talk about this. The start of it is often anti-sexual harassment.
Yeah.
As
in the workplace.
As the starting base, like that's a thing a lot of people can kind of get their heads around.
Yes.
But we move it actually into the conversation of building a consent culture.
Yeah.
To increase productivity, increase employee retention, and then to just help people understand that when working in a communal environment, a consent framework actually helps people do a better job and work in an easier way.
And that's consent with their supervisors and superiors and
with each other. The example we use most often is like if you're working and I come up to you and it's like, hey, do you got a minute? Meaning that as an actual question.
Yeah.
Instead of just a way to grab your attention.
Yes. It's like, I don't have a minute, but I'm going to give it to you because I need to.
Right, but the idea of moving into a consent culture is, hey, I have a question. Do you have a minute?
Mm-hmm.
Waiting for an answer and then respecting the answer, whatever it is.
Yes. Yeah.
And just that change actually increases productivity,
Mm-hmm.
because then you're not pulling people out of their creativity state. You're not pulling them out
Yeah.
of their flow state. You're not pulling them out of their process cognition.
Mm-hmm.
You're actually like, because it's easy to go, no, I need 5 minutes, or I
Yeah.
need half an hour, and not get pulled out of that. But if you have
Mhm.
to stop, answer a question, switch what you're doing on the screen, switch what you're thinking about, and then you're like, okay, I'll go back to getting what I was working on, and it takes you 20 minutes to get back
To
into
get
that state.
back, yeah.
And that's just like a very simple example of using consent to increase not only productivity, but also a sense of community.
Yeah.
Because then people feel like they're respected.
Mm-hmm. And that they can trust you to let them know
Yeah.
that something's up, or what works and doesn't.
And making that change takes time,
Mhm.
right? Because a lot of corporate culture isn't designed that way.
Practice.
But the hope then, I mean, part of the reason why we started teaching in sort of this much wider variety of areas is really the hope is that people will learn and then take that back into their personal life.
Mm-hmm.
And the goal very much is that someone who can practice consent in a non-sexual, non-intense, non-intimate circumstance, it just becomes a muscle.
Yeah.
That when they get into a sexual situation or a highly intimate, or where there's intoxication involved, or any of the other things that reduce capacity,
Yeah.
that they'll do it easier because
It's a more accessible muscle memory type of thing. Yeah. I'm 25 and I don't know, I'm young and inexperienced in my seeking out sexual experiences with new people. And so like practicing this with like trusted partners and like my friends and community in general has made it a lot easier to navigate those not as frequent experiences, because sometimes it really feels like I'm thrown into a completely different world when I'm like I forgot how everything works.
Yeah.
Because you get excited and you're like, am I reading everything wrong? You just learn to trust yourself and remember what you know about how this works.
Yeah. And you were talking about the nuance before. Like, one of the things that I love to talk about is okay, so how do you repair a mistake?
Yes, because they're going to happen.
Because they're going to happen. And I think people have this dream, this fantasy that if you do everything right, nothing will go wrong.
Yeah.
But it turns out human beings are messy.
Yes.
And complicated.
And there's like unexpected reactions that happen. Like I could consent enthusiastically to something and be like, oh, this is not working out the way I thought it would. Harm is happening.
Yeah.
Not to keep harping on what you recently experienced, but not that long ago, you had a close relationship with someone that it wasn't a matter of sexual boundaries. It was just the way things had established.
Yeah.
But things kind of slid into place without agreement.
A real communication about how it was happening.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden this was the expectation. I'm like, why am I feeling so exhausted and resentful all the time?
Mm-hmm.
And then I was like, oh, because we never really had a conversation about this.
Yeah, there were definitely missing conversations.
Allowed, not that this person was like making this happen, like not at all any malicious intent, but just like a failure of us to, more so of me to really look into myself and see, oh, is this good for me? Does this work out? And it started to not work out. The needs changed, and I realized later than I would have liked to that like I was building up some unhappiness towards the other person, and it wasn't their fault at all.
Yeah.
That's where the danger lies in any kind of situation where there are these unspoken things. We operate on intuition or implied things. We never get around to having those direct conversations and ironing out those details, because we haven't started with the easy stuff to get to the develop that muscle memory, so we can have the important conversations about the more nuanced stuff.
I've learned that sometimes just like having a conversation about how the thing or things make me feel, all the different parts of me that are having these reactions, and not necessarily expecting like, okay, how's this change gonna happen as like a response to me talking about all the different feelings that I'm having on something. Because sometimes that, like in the past, that has prevented me from speaking up, because I'm like, well, I don't know what I want out of this from talking about how I'm feeling. And I don't want you to just like assume something and run with that. So you're allowed to just talk about these things and not do anything about them immediately.
Yeah, in psychology, we talk about the difference between an emotional conversation where it's just like we're just talking about the feelings and emotions. There's no direction. There's no anything to solve, right? Versus a negotiation conversation where like I know what I want, you know what you want, and then we're going to negotiate the details and the differences between that. Versus something like a logistical conversation, which is like, okay, who's parking the car?
Yeah.
Right. It's a negotiation, but there's no emotional. Right.
Yeah.
Versus an intellectual conversation where we're just going to talk about a topic and again, I think people have a tendency to like mash them together.
Yes. Yeah.
And when we talk about a consent conversation, like it pulls in different pieces of that. And one of the best ways to have those conversations is to really segregate them. Like, let's talk about how we feel. Let's talk about, like, come to a conclusion about what each of us want. And then actually negotiate the thing.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's applicable in a relationship framework. I think it's also applicable in a brief sexual encounter framework. It's just a question of how long the conversation is.
Yes.
And how many times you come back to it.
Because sometimes you do need to come back to it. Because there have been times where like I get really emotional about something and I'm like, I can't possibly negotiate something after this conversation. I have to.
You got to take a break.
I have to take a break.
Yeah. Makes total sense. And I will say, like, that's how we learn.
Yeah.
Like you said, you're how old?
25.
25. So you're right in the stage where you're trying to figure out how I want to do this.
My frontal lobe is forming.
What my relationships are going to look like.
Yeah.
And that's entirely appropriate. The difficulty is that there are a lot of people who don't figure that out. And so they get into their 30s, 40s, 50s and haven't yet figured out how to manage the what do I want? How do I ask for it? And more importantly, I think, how do I listen to the other person and what they want and what they're asking for?
I'm 48 years old, and even though I've felt like I've had pretty progressive, attentive, deliberate ideas around consent throughout the years, I realized I didn't know shit until the younger generation, the Gen Z folks specifically, were having these intelligent, important conversations around consent. Like, fuck yeah.
Especially getting into like more into BDSM.
You're
exposed to more of those conversations. You're like,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't think about it like that. Wow, you guys are so smart.
Well, and for a lot of years, BDSM often worked on a contextual consent base, where like if you walk into the building or you walk into the back room or you go to the party, there was a certain level of consent that was assumed in that space. It makes sense when you have a press subclass where like it's hidden, it's behind closed doors.
And etiquette that's very much built on consent in like all ways you might engage in that setting.
But then the conversation, culture moves on, and the conversation has moved on with it. And I think we have a much clearer understanding now about how to have those conversations with one another and the nuance.
Yeah.
Right. That it's more than just, show up to the party and whatever happens.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's show up to the party and actually talk to the people
Mhm.
that you're getting involved with, so that you're both on the same page.
Something we were just at the Folsom Street Fair this year.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think either of us had been before, and it was incredibly overwhelming.
Mhm.
Just to see everything happening, the sea of people, and it felt like once you cross the boundaries into the street fair, it was like kind of a free for all. And like what you were gonna see was what you were gonna see, and if you didn't want to see it, you walk the other way.
Yeah.
And in some of the things that I was seeing, like there was some folks doing a scene on a corner where the bottom was getting some impact, and it was pretty red and bloody, and they were like screaming, "Oh God!" Like they needed help, and like, "Oh, ouchie!
Yeah.
Ooh, oh, please God!" And so for like, I can absolutely go the other way, and if that it makes me uncomfortable, but it's also one of those things where I'm like, is that bordering on like maybe don't scream for help in a public area?
Yeah.
And not that like we're deciding right now if it's wrong or right, but
Well, no. When I think the question there is not, and then this is where people get like, big into these conversations,
Yeah.
right? Is it wrong or right?
yes, I don't think
And
there's a place for that. Exactly.
But I think we can have a conversation around what is the impact on the people
Yeah.
present,
Mm-hmm.
and did the people present explicitly consent to the risk of that impact?
Mm-hmm.
And probably not.
No.
Right. There are places where that is an expectation.
Sure.
Right. I could walk into a certain club or walk into a space and be like, that may be happening, and I can choose then to leave the building.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. But for something that happens in public, especially in that kind of venue where there's thousands and thousands of people present, choices were made.
Yes.
And for the people doing it, I'm like, I hope they had a beautiful, wonderful time.
Mm-hmm.
It looked like it was beautiful, wonderful. Didn't sound like it.
Right. But thinking about it in a larger community context,
Yeah.
like my concern is, did we lose people out of the BDSM community?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who saw that, experienced it, heard it, and said, no, this is too much, and never came back.
Yeah. Because any other setting, people are going to be like, there's going to be a CNC scene.
Mm-hmm.
This is what you can expect. If you're not comfortable with that, they're going to get a heads up and kind of an explanation of what that might entail before they're actually confronted with it.
Mm-hmm.
My concern would be, yes, people being turned off, new to BDSM, being turned off from it.
Getting the wrong idea also. Like,
or calling the police thinking that it's
like someone's
nobody's
actually
doing
having a tough
anything
time.
about, and then that screws all kinds of things up.
Yeah, and that idea that it's, depending on who the people were and what was going on, like there's an extra level of risk,
Yeah.
involved in that kind of engagement.
If it's within your risk profile, then go for it. There's a million things that I can think of like what I might see at the street fair, but that was not on the list. I thought of a lot of creative things, and I did check a lot of them off, but that was not on there.
You had your Folsom Street bingo card.
Yeah. I got bingo pretty quickly. Yeah. It was very cool. It was incredibly overwhelming. I look forward to going back again. It's like knowing more about what to expect.
Yeah. When we were talking about doing this chat, I'd sent you some links to some conversations that were had on the Drunk Church podcast. And I was wondering if you had a chance to listen to those.
I did. Not all of them.
They're long episodes.
Yeah,
so.
But I appreciate you turning me on to the podcast.
I love Drunk Church.
It's some really, really interesting, philosophical conversations. It's great.
Kind of like for those first couple episodes, I don't even recall the name of the book that they were discussing. So I haven't gotten around to actually reading the book yet, but it kind of sounds like, to simplify the conversation that is being had in and around that book, is that, especially in kink and BDSM, but not exclusively,
Right.
that the version of ourselves that shows up that is more vulnerable and expressive is different than the person. It's like the subconscious side of the person that does the negotiation. So that more vulnerable,
Top space, bottom space, subspace, dom space type of.
yeah, there are two different versions of a person negotiating versus
Presenting in the scene.
yeah,
Yeah.
attending the event.
Mm-hmm.
Completely different headspaces. And that kind of poses the question, can one person be negotiating on behalf of the other, really? I mean, yes, you establish trust and you negotiate and you do all this work to prepare for what might happen.
Mm-hmm.
But there's kind of, depending on what you're getting into, you kind of have to rely on this blanket consent to some extent, this deep trust.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe limited if you're just going to a club and you're doing a pickup impact scene or something. It's very narrow parameters. But if it's more intense, you're taking a lot of risk. You don't know how that more vulnerable version of yourself might respond that one time to things.
Mm-hmm.
Things can go sideways.
Absolutely.
Stuff can come up that you never even knew was there. And all of a sudden, that breaks apart your entire relationship with that person you were engaging with. It
could.
I'm just saying.
Yeah.
That because sometimes, especially in kink BDSM, more intense intimacy, just things can happen. You're not exactly sure why. You can spend the next year or two picking it apart, and you do eventually figure it out. But you're playing with fire. The more intense,
sometimes literally.
Yeah, the more intense it is, the greater the risk, and that doesn't mean that we don't need these various consent models, and shouldn't be constantly renegotiating, and having evolving communication. But at the end of the day, trust is crucial.
Oh yeah.
Whoever you're engaging with.
I mean, it somewhat goes back to the conversation we were having before, right? Is that so I like to go hiking. I like to get up into the mountains, and my experience with that has varied a lot over the years in terms of how much time I have and everything else. But the more often you do it, the easier it is. And I find that the consent base is the same thing, right? The more often a person engages in not just consensual interactions with others, but consensual interactions within themselves, like they query their internal self and be like, are we really up for this?
Yeah.
Like, do we really want to do that? It builds that internal muscle. And so when you get into those really intimate spaces, you can fall back on sort of the reliance of my body will move the way it needs to move, even if I'm not consciously aware.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, it's more like my internal self will move the way it needs to move, even if I'm not like if my prefrontal cortex isn't online and pushing through it. And so the space is interesting, right? Because it brings up the difficult philosophical questions of, like, to start, can we even know our internal self?
Oh
Truly, fully.
Yeah.
And then if I'm playing with somebody else, right, then there's like, if I can't fully know my internal self, there's no way I'm going to fully know their internal self.
No. Or them you.
Yeah, or them me. And so we find ourselves in this place of like, okay, how much trust do I have in this person? And that just gets complicated. Like if it's somebody I'm in a relationship with, like we build trust over time. And one of the most interesting parts of that is that part of the way we build trust in relationships is to have that trust occasionally broken and then repair, which strengthens the like, oh, we can get through this.
Yes.
And so I've seen scenes go like horribly wrong. And the people, like, it's huge and it's emotional and everybody's upset. And, in one case, somebody had to go to the hospital. Like, I've seen scenes go horribly wrong. And the next day they sit down and they talk about it. And it takes time to rebuild the trust out of that whatever it was that happened. But they can, because they've built up enough of a reservoir of trust to begin with. So even when their internal self goes, that internal self can come back and go, oh no, wait, we know this, it's familiar. We can come back to it. I think one of the difficulties is when we're talking about pickup play or first time, or like, in that first NRE phase of a relationship where everything feels good and nothing feels safe. Right, when one of those incidents happen in that context, then we're looking at internalized trauma, and that internal self goes, "You hurt me. You must be bad, and therefore I will attribute to you malice." Instead of, if it's somebody I've trusted, like, you hurt me. I know you're not bad.
That must have been a mistake.
It must have been a mistake. You still hurt me, but we can work that out. And so the scenes that I've seen go very bad and have lasting consequences fall into that place where people don't have any trust built up. And it's very hard in the community to be in that place and recover from that place. And so that internal self, like, can we know him, her, them, it? I think we can know them partially. I think they speak to us. But we're never going to be able to fully predict its behavior. And therefore, we can never fully predict when something is going to go right or when something is going to go wrong. Because the opposite, I think, is true. Like, sometimes you're like, oh, I'm just going to do this simple thing. And it feels totally euphoric. Like, I found a thing I never encountered before. Like, oh my God, this feels so good.
They must be magic.
Like that is the joy of it. And so we walk the line between risk and joy.
It makes me think about, I'm often relying on like my response to a stimulus to know if I actually want it. I'm bad at like coming up with knowing exactly what I want or an idea of what I want before it happens. And so I try to be like, I don't know, try a few things and I'll let you know how I feel about them. And so to be able to like listen to your own response to a stimulus and like check in and be like, okay, yeah, that's good. Yeah, keep doing something like that. Try it further or try something different.
And in that place, you can sit in and be like, all right, like, here's some things to try, like, and then I'll stop if it feels bad, or I'll tell you to go ahead if it feels good. And that's where consent is the real important thing. Right? That you can communicate in some way, verbally or non-verbally, of like, that you can manage through and trust that the person you're doing it with
is seeing that,
will see it and listen. And that's where we kind of walk this line between it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good. It's not good.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Right. And it's good, it's good, it's good. It's not good. Person stops. Okay, go back to what was good and build from there in a different
Go
direction.
in a different direction. Yeah.
Versus it's good, it's good, it's good. It's not good. Person doesn't stop. Trauma.
Yeah.
Right. Assault.
Mm-hmm.
And in BDSM, where that line can be seconds long.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, in the Consent Academy, we really talk about a lot capacity,
Mm-hmm.
and not just the capacity of the bottom or the submissive, but the capacity of the dominant or the top
Mm-hmm.
to be able to receive consent,
Mhm.
right? The yes or the no,
Mm-hmm.
and be able to have the capacity to pay attention
Yeah.
even in intense emotional circumstances.
Because there are so many things that can inform you about how that person is feeling, besides being like, yes, it's good, or no, I'm not feeling it.
Yeah,
Right.
to understand what the responsibility of that taking part in that action is, and yeah, being able to monitor, continually evaluate their state, read all of their signs. Are you willing to? Are you looking to just beat somebody or whatever it is,
Yeah.
and when you're done, or are you going to
Take them to a
learn
place.
all of their signs and ride that line? And you know, it requires a lot of emotional, mental energy to do that.
Yeah. And it's like, if that's like, okay, like I spend my whole day getting ready to go to the party, and then I'm in that place and I'm mentally prepared and it's great. Cool. But so how often have we seen people like they've had a long day at work,
Mm-hmm.
right? Maybe they had a couple of drinks with dinner.
Mm-hmm.
They're tired. It's the end of a work week, and they're like, I still want to go to the party.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they're okay for the first 30 minutes, but the fatigue just gets to them.
Yeah.
Right. The way I often talk about it is, at that point, you're just rolling dice,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're relying on the odds,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
and hoping you get lucky.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of conversation that I like to have around consent, which is, it's not, follow these 5 steps and you're good,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
right? It's, how do you understand your own capacity, your own level of knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
your own skills around consent, and yours and the other person's concept of autonomy.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you build that in to a practice that just comes naturally after a time?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times I hear people are like, but that sounds like so much work.
I was just
Mhm.
thinking that in my head. I was like, how do you do that though? What are the signs and what are the direction that points you that you're like, okay, this person kind of gets it,
Mhm.
Well,
not just conversation.
I mean, conversation, but also, especially if it's someone new,
Yeah.
just like what we talk about with when you're practicing boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
right? You set a boundary and you see how the person reacts to it.
Yeah.
You start something and then you say, no, stop, and you see how they react to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so you build trust based both on conversation,
Mm-hmm.
but also on behavior.
Exactly. No, I like these days. I'm much more patient than I was when I was younger.
Yeah.
Far less interested in play with people that I don't know.
Yeah.
Any kind of encounter. I like to start with sending them a 7-page BDSM checklist and being like,
It's extensive.
yes, not only fill it out, but I want to see the exchange as, we're working up to you filling that out, because
Mm-hmm.
how serious are you about communicating these things,
Mm-hmm.
making sure that I understand these things about you.
Yeah. Are you going to do the work?
Yeah, because if you're like, fucking around and you're not filling out the sheet and you're dragging your feet about it, like that tells me that you're not serious about this, or you're not on the same level as me. Like you're not going to put in the same effort and understanding that I'm trying to.
Just like in vetting people for the group play that
That is
us and
something
our
that
friends
I have,
that, you know,
yeah, I've given you a lot of trust to do that because
Yeah.
we've built up a lot of trust.
and I've thrown these checklists at these people. I'm like, these are the kinds of things that you can expect to take part in if we, you know, once we get there. But I need you to fill out this checklist.
Yeah.
So far, I've only gotten 2 back,
Okay.
and you know, sure, it's disappointing, you know, but I've been trying to vet people for this kind of stuff for 15 years, and this is how most of it goes.
Yeah. And it's, you know, for the folks who are like, I just want to fuck around and find out.
Mm-hmm.
Be it on your head.
I mean,
Yeah.
and that is the tricky part where, like, if that is your way of doing it, that is fine. Again, we're not talking about morality. We're not talking about right and wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But everybody's got to be on the same page that
Mhm.
that's what you're doing. And when something goes wrong,
Mm-hmm.
because again, humans are messy, complex people.
Shit goes wrong.
Shit goes wrong. And
Mhm.
when that happens, you then are tacitly agreeing to take responsibility and manage what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people don't.
No.
Right? They're like, I'm going to fuck around and find out. Oh, something went wrong?
Bye.
Must be your fault.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They project blame and guilt onto the other person
Mhm.
so that they don't have to internalize it and do the work
Yeah.
around it. And it's human.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
It's very human, but you know, to your previous example, if you're doing like, okay, we're gonna do a simple impact scene,
Mm-hmm.
like, ow, that hurt. I'm gonna have some welts or maybe a bruised muscle,
Mhm.
right? Okay, that is an outcome I can accept. But I'm gonna go do a full suspension with impact play,
Mm-hmm.
right? And now I'm risking permanent nerve damage
Yeah.
if it's
Yeah.
done poorly or wrong.
Mhm.
I'm gonna manage my risk.
Yeah.
You know, and then we take that to the psychological side,
Mm-hmm.
right? And like, you know, oh, here, call me this dirty name,
Mhm.
right? You know, call me a bitch. I know that. I know what's going to happen. If it triggers me, I can be like, oh, that was my choice. Like, I
Mhm.
wanted to see what that felt like. Great. But yeah, just call me dirty names, right? And someone like pulls up something from my past.
Yeah.
And now like I'm totally flooded,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
which means I may or may not be able to communicate what's going on with me.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
And we've entered into a whole new
Mm-hmm.
space
Mhm.
at that point.
I mean, what do you do in that situation? You just say, hold on, something's coming up for me that I
Mhm.
wasn't expecting.
I mean, that's the complicated part.
Yeah.
Right. So if we talk about like acute trauma reactions,
Mhm.
you know, fight, flight, most people know, thanks to the US Army. Freeze,
Mhm.
like,
I'm a freezer.
you
And
know,
then there's fawn.
and then
Yeah.
fawn.
Yeah.
And then there's also, some people argue that there's also fatigue,
Mm-hmm.
where you just get tired.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for someone who fights back, that's pretty easy to know. For someone who tries to escape, that's
Mhm.
fairly easy to recognize. But if you're way into top space,
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
someone freezing may or may not be initially evident.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And fawning gets people all the time,
Yeah.
right? Because it's the like, I'll do anything you want.
Mhm.
If you don't, and here's where you get to that complex and nuance, right? Because like,
Yeah.
if I know you and I know how you normally react,
Mm-hmm.
if you change behavior,
That's a tell.
that's my cue to be like, something has changed. We need to
Mhm.
pull back and figure out what.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If I just met you for the first time, I don't know if that's normal or
Yeah.
not. If I keep going, right, then I risk more physical, psychological, emotional impact.
Mhm.
Will I then take responsibility for that
Yeah.
and be like, all right, I'm going to spend the next 2 weeks helping you process what just happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I'm going to spend $1,000 and pay for your therapy.
Mm-hmm.
That's very generous.
Right. You know, whatever it is, because it's different,
Yeah.
going to be different for each person. But if I was planning on a 90-minute encounter,
Mhm.
am I willing to do that and take responsibility for the potential outcome.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And people don't, and this is where we get into that thing of like, oh, I like, how do I think about this complexity?
Mm-hmm.
The main complexity that I think people need to think about is, what is my level of responsibility in this interaction?
Mm-hmm.
And am I willing to do that?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And if the answer is no, don't do it.
Mhm.
That informs your next
That
choice.
That informs your choice.
Yeah.
You know, and that's where the consent conversation gets into the deep weeds in the nuance, where we're not just talking about like, hey, do you consent for me to whip you with a flogger?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Do I consent to the potential impact or outcome of whipping you with a flogger?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's how you have that deeply complex conversation in advance.
That actually makes a lot of sense. That's a fantastic way to think about it. I mean, we've talked about this a couple times. The time that you were whipping me, and I like started to be like get anxious and get into a space that I didn't want to be in.
Mm-hmm.
And like I think you would like hit the whip on the floor, and I like
Mhm.
jumped in a way and
Yeah.
like started like shivering.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I was like, I think I'm scared.
Mm-hmm.
And you were like, okay, let's lay down for a bit.
Right.
I cried it out for a bit, and I
Yeah.
was like, I don't know, I couldn't see, I couldn't hear so well.
And now I'm really anxious to get back to that space and like find a way to get there deliberately and
Yeah.
navigate that in new ways.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, it took me weeks to like felt like shit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I felt like I totally fucked things up, and it was just kind of a sequence of events that just put you in a very anxious state. But in recent conversations with quite a few people, we've talked about how alt-right, the patriarchy, tends to, of course, they have a problem with bodily autonomy.
Yeah.
Even though rugged individualism is like
It's all about personal autonomy, but it's about like, I get to have autonomy, you don't get to have autonomy.
Yeah.
And
It takes the other person or people out of the conversation.
and the things about the identities and the expression of the more marginalized communities is proudly being vulnerable with each other and being part of community.
Yeah.
Being vulnerable, being autonomous, participating, sharing in culture threatens
Yeah.
this patriarchy. And so they're pushing back very hard to re-implement these policies, these laws and social structures from 100 years ago. Historically, yes, we have a precedent for denying people autonomy, but
Sure.
What kinds of concerns do you have in regards to the conversations that people are currently having around consent? Are you worried that people are going to stop having those as things shift?
Yeah. So, well, let me start off with it. As a queer, non-binary trans person, the space in which politics has entered into identity erasure, politicized bigotry, and political violence against marginalized communities. I think you're right. Historically is nothing new. Like, that's been a tool of the larger social hegemony for a long time. I think it's going to be a hard space. I do truly believe that progress and change towards more acceptance within a society is like the overall trend.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's this current backlash is going to be incredibly difficult and is going to cause a lot of pain, and that people will die in the process. Like I don't think we're just talking about, oh, it's going to be a hardship for people. The rates of suicide, the rates of hate crimes, the rates of bullying and other forms of interpersonal violence are all projected to go up as the rhetoric gets louder and louder.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where we're starting from. There will be people who decide, well, if that's the way the wind is blowing, then let's double down on it. Let's do more of that. The fear that I have actually a lot of fear around it, but in this context, the fear that I have around it is that as people start to degrade the concept of other people's autonomy, right? I don't get to express and hold my authentic identity because it makes other people uncomfortable. That's the sort of the baseline of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
As that message becomes louder and not overt, right? That's the covert message. It's the behind the scenes message. That people will internalize that.
Yeah.
And start to enact that in other ways. That the rugged individualism, Pax Americana, right? That space of like, I am strong, therefore I get to set terms for everyone else, I think is going to cause a lot of pain. And historically, the backlash to the backlash creates progress. And so I think we will see that. In the meantime, my encouragement to people will be very much in the space of like, hold your own boundaries. Not just like set them and like, oh, here's my boundary. I expect everybody to live by that. But to put some practice into like, here's my boundary, and no, you don't get to cross it.
Yeah.
Like, this is the line. You don't get to come over the line. And if you do, I'm out.
Yeah.
I think that kind of behavior will determine the space of really engaging in the consent in a new way, because it means the people who like, oh, I don't have to worry about that, will get what they want.
Yeah.
And if you find yourself, if you find yourself on the other side of it, where someone's like, hey, I said no, and you pushed anyway, right, really take that in and be like, oh, is that the kind of person I want to be? Do I want to be someone who harms someone else because of my own wants or needs? And if the answer is yes, by the way, I'm Seattle, please don't play in my space. But most of the time the answer is going to be no. And so take a look at it. Like, once you're out of that initial emotional space, like we were talking before, take a look at it and be like, is this who I want to be? Is there not a better way? Right? How can I still honor who I am and respect the consent and the boundaries of the people around me? As a community, I think if we can do that and hold people to that in a way that is both firm and compassionate, instead of firm and ostracizing, which is what happens too much. I think if we can hold to that firm and compassionate space, we will get through it. It's just like, we're going to see the wave, and how we react to that wave as a community, I think, is going to define who we are as a community. Which means that we have the opportunity to help and support people through this time, instead of the risk, which is to ostracize the people who are being ostracized by others, to accept hate and bigotry into our community and enforce that space. We can do better.
For sure.
I personally think consent is a big piece of that, and honoring consent is a big piece of that.
It's my heart. Yeah. Mm.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
It's been my
wonderful
pleasure.
getting a chance to talk with you, and I hope we get to chat again
Yeah.
in the future. Last night when we showed up, I'm like, because I grew up here.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, this feels like home. We definitely got to come back. We've got to come back.
Oh yeah, definitely come back. If anyone is interested, the Consent Academy puts on regular workshops. We have some online sort of at your own pace content, and we do organizational consulting. You can find us at www.consent.academy. We'd love to help in these trying times ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have personal stories and observations you would like to share about kink, BDSM, non-monogamy, and where neurodivergence, mental health, gender expression, community, and politics all intersect?
Maybe you have a request for a topic or a guest.
We welcome people in these communities to reach out to let us know how we're doing, to share their stories and interests,
and help us to shape how we contribute to healthy, informative conversations on sex, kink, non-monogamy, and queer culture.
We would love for our fellow kinksters, E&M, and queer people to ask questions, make content requests, and share your stories. You can remain anonymous, or
if you'd like to be a guest on the podcast, shoot us an email and let us know a little bit about you.
to get in touch with us, go to subspaceexploration.com/contact.
Please comment, like, share, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Acast, and RSS feed. Goodbye.
Goodbye.